Webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our first webinar in NACOLE's 2021 webinar series. Although many of you are familiar with NACOLE and the work that we do throughout the year, NACOLE is an organization that for the last 26 years has worked to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the communities they serve. For information about NACOLE, training opportunities, and resources, please visit nacole.org. Also, please be on the lookout for our upcoming report on the state of the field and effective practices in civilian oversight. We have recently received word that it will be ready for publication in the next 2 to 3 weeks. This groundbreaking work looks at the history and current state of our field, as well as the principles and effective practices that should guide it. At the same time, we'll be releasing 9 case studies of civilian oversight agencies across the United States and launching an online toolkit that will allow users to access information about participating oversight agencies. By coincidence, we have with us today the directors of 2 of the agencies who participated in these case studies and the primary author of the case studies and the report, Mike Viteroulis. I'd like to thank Mike for putting today's session together, and Susan Hudson, NACOLE President, and Mike Tobin for accepting the invitations to discuss analyzing and reporting use of force statistics. Before we begin, I want to remind all of you that you have entered today's webinar in listen-only mode. During the session, however, you will have the ability to type in questions that you have, and I will read them for you when the time comes. I'd like to also remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. And with that, I will hand things over to Mike. Mike?
Thank you, Cami, and thank you for all that you do at NACOLE. I'd also like to thank all of the attendees that are joining us today. I want to start by introducing our 2 speakers, Mike Tobin and Susan Hudson. Susan Hudson is currently the president of NACOLE and the independent police monitor for the city of New Orleans. She was appointed the independent police monitor in June of 2010. Prior to accepting the position in New Orleans, Ms. Hudson worked at the Los Angeles Police Commission's Office of the Inspector General as an assistant inspector general and as the acting police monitor at the Office of the Police Monitor in Austin, Texas. Prior to working in police oversight, Ms. Hudson was a general practitioner, defense counsel, prosecutor, and assistant city attorney handling labor matters. Ms. Hudson holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD from Tulane University School of Law. Ms. Hudson was elected to a 2-year term as a president of NACOLE in September 2019 and as a past president of the International Law Enforcement Auditors Association. Mike Tobin is the executive director of the Washington D.C. Office of Police Complaints. He was appointed the executive director in November 2014. Prior to joining the agency, Mike Tobin served as the executive director of the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission, where he oversaw the commission's work in a range of functions, including the initiation and implementation of police policies and procedures, conducting independent investigations of misconduct allegations, ensuring internal investigations are conducted appropriately, and providing mediation between citizens and fire or police department employees. Mr. Tobin began his career with the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin as a police officer, and upon graduation from law school, he joined the Milwaukee City Attorney's Office as an assistant city attorney. There, he was a police legal advisor, guided internal affairs investigations, prosecuted police employees for misconduct, and represented the city's interests in police department litigation for almost 20 years in state courts and administrative agencies. As Cami mentioned in the beginning, my name is Mike Viteroulis. I am formerly a researcher at NACOLE and a member of the Training, Education, and Standards Committee for a number of years, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Today's webinar is the first of what will hopefully be a series of webinars focused on policy and data analysis. These webinars are in response to a growing number of oversight agencies, particularly newer ones, that have some role in policy review. But I believe we will have something here for everyone today. For community members, there's an opportunity to see different ways of visualizing use of force data that may be of interest. And for those joining us in law enforcement, in addition to seeing some potentially new forms of analyzing use of force data, there'll be an opportunity to reflect a bit on your own force reporting systems. We won't go super in depth in evaluating force reporting systems themselves, but for anybody who is interested in the topic, a super important one in my opinion, I would highly recommend reading the New York City Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD's investigation of the NYPD's force reporting system. We've broken today's webinar into 5 components shown on the next slide. Please, Cami. We're going to try to leave about 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions from folks in the audience. And without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. We'll start with Mike Tobin from the Washington D.C. Office of Police Complaints, who will give us an overview of the Metropolitan Police Department's use of force policy and force reporting system.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate that introduction. And welcome everybody this afternoon. I really appreciate you joining us today. We're going to spend the next 60 minutes discussing and then 30 minutes with a question and answer period about use of force reporting and analyzing it. And I want to try to start out today by trying to more or less set the stage for what we're talking about and why we're doing it. Sort of a general overview, and then I want to talk more specifically later on in our time about what we're doing in Washington, D.C., the history of that, and maybe talk about what we did in Milwaukee. And you can use what we've done here as a starting template and try to pick out what works best for your agency and your police department and your community. And that's really how we started out here in D.C. was we looked around at what other departments, both police departments and oversight agencies, were doing with use of force reporting. And we tried to pick out what worked best for us and try to identify those best practices. So that's what I encourage you to do today, is try to pick out some things that work for you, because some of these things are going to be generic. So let's set the stage and talk about first, why do we even need to report use of force? It may seem like an obvious question, but the answer to that might be different depending on whether you're a police department or whether you're a community member or a community oversight agency. When you think about it, because police departments historically, especially over the last 25 years or so, are really collecting a lot of data. They collect reams and reams of data and information. And then the hard part becomes, well, what do we do with that data and how do we use it? Beginning when police departments started with New York, and now it's spread across the country in most major urban police departments, the concept of CompStat and analyzing crime stats and using that data to inform departments. That started really in earnest probably a little bit more than a decade ago in a lot of other departments. And what it shows us is that police departments are identifying, many of them are identifying as being data driven. And when you think about it and when you talk to the police chiefs, really what they mean in our world of police oversight, what they're talking about when a police department says they're data driven, most of the time they're talking about crime statistics. They're not talking about use of force data, police complaint data, contacts data, things like that. They're talking primarily that they're data driven with respect to crime stats. They have crime analysts now. Some of them have platoons of crime analysts, one or two or several at each police district, several at the main headquarters in many larger urban departments. And they like to pride themselves on being data driven. Well, the question comes up, why don't we do this, and why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we data driven with respect to use of force? Because there's so much data out there that can be useful. And this is why it's useful to police departments, and this is how we can sell it more to police departments that are hesitant in publicizing their use of force data and getting it out there to the public. Because one of the main features of it, if we do a good job of it, whether it's a police department reporting or us as an oversight agency reporting, is that we can address staffing issues, we can address assignments, we can training, policies, and especially training and policies with use of force data. And that'll help the departments move forward. And that's one of the prime reasons why we want to use of force data. What I found, and I'm not talking in particular about Washington, D.C., although most of my experience is informed around D.C. and the city of Milwaukee. Well, what I found that just in general, there's three main reasons for pushback on reporting use of force data. And you can evaluate their importance or not in your own communities, but the three ones that I've heard that I'm familiar with is: one, we don't have the budget to do it; two, we don't have the personnel to do it; and three, something they don't say but is implicit is, three, we're afraid of what it might show, and we're afraid of what the data might show. So a lot of times you'll get pushback from what I've seen for one, two, or all three of these reasons: the budget, not enough personnel, or we don't know what the data is going to show, but we don't think it's going to be favorable, so we really don't want to do it. So those are the three things we have to get over. We have to get over that hump and emphasize that analyzing this data, collecting it in a good, usable way, and publishing it to the community is really going to be helpful with the police department. And I'll tell you one of the main reasons why that is. And this is something that we need to really emphasize with the police chiefs, is that by and large, the vast majority of use of force incidents are a rare incident as they're compared to the number of arrests, the number of citizen contacts, the number of dispatch calls for service. If you look at all that and compare them, and we do that in some of our reporting, you will be communicating to the public that overall the use of force is a comparatively rare instance, which is contrary to what many people in the community believe after watching the latest 6 o'clock news or watching the latest TV shows. Every other one, which is happens to be a crime drama, which involves numerous uses of police use of force usually. So the largest databases, it's interesting when up until maybe just very recently, the last 2 or 3 years, the largest national databases on use of force in policing were kept by the news media. One of them is right across the street from where I'm at right now. That's the Washington Post. They were one of the largest databases for police use of force. And then the next question that begs an answer is, why have the news media had to take an opening role on reporting use of force? Why aren't we as oversight agencies doing it more? And why aren't the police departments themselves doing it more? And I theorize that it's one or all of those three reasons that I gave you, with budget, personnel, and what the results would, fearing what the results might be. So now what's happened over the last few years was there's been a push to report it, and it's more and more departments are reporting it. And in January of 2019, the FBI initialized their national voluntary use of force database, where police departments can start reporting to the FBI on a voluntary basis. And this past year, their opening year when they did it, according to the FBI anyway, they had 41% of all eligible agencies voluntarily reported their use of force to the FBI. And when you look at it, and you can go on their website too and see, it's kind of it's a minimal amount of information that's being reported. And we're going to go into detail a little bit later about what types of information may be more useful. But even for just reporting a minimum amount, less than half of departments are submitting to the voluntary FBI database on use of force reporting. Another interesting factoid is, and I couldn't find a reference, it's in my head right now, I don't remember where I got it from, but just in the past week, 57 out of the 100 largest police departments, municipal police departments in the country, as of June, have adopted some type of use of force policy that's more restrictive than what they had before. Most commonly, that restriction would be a restriction prohibiting chokeholds, so things like that. So departments are making adjustments to policies on use of force, but they're not necessarily reporting it publicly, what the statistics are, and they're not necessarily reporting on what data they are using to make their policy adjustments. And of course, those are reasons why we want to analyze the data and why we want to put it out there to the community. So I thought that was kind of interesting that that's the state that we're at now. And with many more departments now wanting to publicize it. The next question you're going to have to ask, I think, in our own communities, and we did it in DC just a few years ago in 2017, was yes, we want to report the data, but who is going to report it? Is it going to be the police department, or is it going to be the oversight agency? Well, in DC, we decided that as a matter of community discussion, the DC Council voted and required my office, the oversight agency, to do the reporting on all the use of force incidents. In some agencies, the police department might be still doing it, or some places, both of them might be doing it. But I would suggest that it would be to the advantage of the police department and the community if an outside agency does the reporting. And it's not just because that's the way we do it in DC and that's the way we did it in Milwaukee, but I really think that it adds to community trust, and it helps the police department because they can always point to the independent oversight agency saying, hey, look, they did the reports. They analyzed it. They said that it was a valid information, and it wasn't us reporting on ourselves. And that's very helpful with community trust. So we can sell it to police agencies, and we can sell it to the community at large by saying, first of all, we think that the data overall, if you have a good policy, procedure, and training program set up, overall, the data probably will show that use of force is a statistically rare event when it comes to comparing to all police contacts. It will help with community understanding and community trust, because once the community knows when use of force is used, when it's used, how often, what time of day, what districts, what the demographics are, when it's used, and the type of force that's used. And once that's described and it's written down in black and white, people can see that in numbers and data and infographics that are really helpful. It's going to help the community trust. And when we increase community trust in the police department, every officer's job will be easier on the street because their trust will be increased with community members that they deal with. So that's kind of where I wanted to start with setting the stage on why we should report, why we should get every police department on board, even those that are not completely on board right now, and how we can help the police departments and the community with this reporting. So I hope that's a decent introduction to where we want to go with use of force reporting in our local communities and nationally.
Thanks, Mike. We'll turn it over to Susan now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mike and Mike. Glad to be here. Thank all of our members and practitioners and community for being here as well. Needless to say, use of force is prevalent every day in our lives and in our work, in our society. After we just watched what went down at the Capitol and the differences in responses between what went down at the Capitol versus what occurred last summer during the uprising, we can't help but think, man, disparity, 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 systemic injustice, and systemic racism. And what we know from that is that, and this is being in New Orleans now is the second consent decree I've been under. I was also at LAPD. I know there are a number of cities that have been through consent decrees. And what we know about systemic racism and injustice is that these consent decrees do not stop these disparities. It's built into the law. It's built into the tenets of the law. So as we attack and reform or just change use of force altogether, I just want to keep in mind that we have to look at those tenets of use of force law that were created to control a certain population. You know, I'd always looked at Graham versus Connor and Tennessee versus Garner, and I just read the tenets and just applied them. I never went back and actually looked at the people and what happened in those particular cases. I encourage you to do so. Tennessee versus Garner, a 15-year-old shot in the back of the head while running away with no weapon. Graham versus Connor, Graham being an African-American male who was having a diabetic attack and was seen as suspicious and then got the tar beat out of him by the police as a result of that. So just look, and then these, basically the Supreme, now to be certain, use of force had been going wild for a while on some people. But these two Supreme Court cases went ahead and put that Supreme Court stamp of approval on being able to do these types of things as long as you articulate certain things. So as we think about our journey going forward and where we're going to, remember that, you know, institutions are only going to reform so much, and we need our community to come forward to grapple with those other parts of injustice. Now, having said that, we've come a long way in New Orleans. When I got here in 2010, police had reports about the force that they'd used, the complaints that they'd taken, and I said, "Oh, great, where's it at? Can I get a copy of it?" And they said, "Sure." And they gave me a hand-counted bundle or bundled report, and I was like, "Oh, great, I want to share this with the community." They were like, "What? No, absolutely not. We cannot do that. We cannot share any of that information with the community." Not only that, it was hand counted and I'm not sure about the accuracy of it, but that's the way it was. So we had to push with that, and we actually bought a database, IA Pro, for our police department to use, which we owned at the time so that we could access this information. And then we started reporting for the department without being required to. We reported their official stats each year. And that went on until from 2010 to probably 2014 or so, at which time the consent decree really kicked in and the police department then was able to start providing some numbers. Now, they still weren't providing deep analysis or breakdowns in data. So if you get a chance to go to our website at nolaipm.gov, you can see how over the years we've been able to break down that data more, look at disparities in race, so on and so forth. But they've come a long way from where they were at. And so just want to give them those kudos and that credit. Our office monitors the most serious level of use of force very, very closely. And like some of you have gone through consent decrees, the department just had use of force. And when the consent decree kicked in, then they went to levels of force and who investigates those and so on and so forth. And those do not actually lined up completely with how we monitor force. So the most serious uses of force, we roll out to the scene of, monitor investigation, so on and so forth, so that we can provide some qualitative information too about how those are investigated and whether or not that force was appropriate or not. We do keep a close watch on how they report and use force. And we want to take it to that next level going forward. In February, our city council will vote on a public-facing database that we will control, in which they would provide money for us to actually create and upkeep. We'd already been putting out data, but you know, if you want a real database that is usable and accurate, you need some funds behind that, and we needed the law behind that. We think we're going to get that in February, and we're very excited about that. And like I said, as you're working on reforms and use of force and systems and using police violence, you really have to involve your community in that. So as we create this database, which was an impetus from our community, we are going to create it in such a way that it helps them. We're going to include our public defenders, our district attorney, our grassroots movements, our organizations like ACLU and so on and so forth, and NAACP. So we're going to use their input in making this something that is usable. As Mike said, there's a dearth of information out there from the government itself. Here in New Orleans, we're trying to make up for that and do something much better. The NOPD already, and the city puts out a lot of data, but the data is not relatable to a particular officer, and there's very little qualitative information or details about what went on. So we're looking forward to getting that out there for our community. So we've come a long way. But we've got a ways to go. We're very excited about looking at it more and looking at how we work on these disparities. I think DC's data and New Orleans data and all data will show that there's still a great disparity, and how do we do something about that? So that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Stephen. I wanted to transition a little bit into collecting the actual force data from the respective departments that you oversee. Now, as many of us know, police data is quite messy, and sometimes things span different types of forms, and depending on what you're counting for, you actually may get a completely different accounting of, use of force incidents. Things may not necessarily line up with where things should be, and that certainly presents a challenge when you're trying to report on use of force for a particular period. So I guess we can start with Mike. Can you, go over some of the process that you guys use at OPC to collect that data and validate that data and ensure that it's as complete as possible?
Sure. And I'll start out by saying, here's the big warning on it. And here's what you're very likely to find is once you start collecting the data and start putting together a report, that's when you find out all of the weaknesses in the data collection, in the reporting system, in the police department's collection and reporting system, and how you're going to put together the report. You'll find one stumbling block after another, as we did, as far as what we want to collect, how it's collected, and what's reported. I'll give you some quick examples of that. First of all, we discovered when we first started our current iteration of use of force reporting, that was in 2017, and that was by DC local government mandate to start reporting and collecting on it. The police department were using two different forms. It was not an electronic form, and we were typically missing a lot of data. We had to manually enter all of the data from the two different use of force reporting forms that they had. We had to manually pull out from the narratives of those reports different elements and variables that we wanted to report on. And we found that the data collection itself was really lacking as far as from the perspective of being able to really analyze it, proof it for a good report and usable information. So that was our starting point, was when we first started out, was to say, wow, everything is in pretty much disarray because the police department wasn't collecting it for the purpose of reporting on it. They were collecting it for the purpose of writing a report so that they could memorialize the actual use of force, not necessarily analyze it and use it to improve policies, procedures, and training. Well, now we come full circle after a number of years, and we've gotten to the point now where, and by the way, our first report and every report includes recommendations. And that's always a good place to end your report, is to make your recommendations on how to do it better next time. And most of our recommendations to the police department here in Washington were followed over the first couple of years, and it took us about 2 years really to get to the point where we were able to move to full electronic reporting, which I believe is really important. You overcome a lot of obstacles in use of force reporting when you can have electronic reporting, because then you can add drop-down bars that are mandatory. You can list what types of information you want to collect, and you can make sure that the report writer, whether it's the officer or the officer's supervisor, completes that use of force report in its entirety, and you won't have as much problems with missing information. Initially, we had a lot of data that was missing, and it lends itself to a report that's really not that accurate. So electronic reporting, I think it became a must here in the nation's capital. And once we got to that point, it was much easier then to add different drop-down boxes, drop-down menus about the different types of data to collect, because that's the other warning, the second warning I want to give, is at the very outset when you're starting out, try to figure out what exactly the data is you want to collect and report on, what the elements are, what the variables are, because the ultimate goal is to compare these things over time. And you want to have the same variables compared over a number of years. And when you look at our report, you'll see that that's what we try to do. We try to go back every year. We go back for 5 years and try to compare the same variables and same elements over that time period. There are challenges with that. One of them being policies and procedures change over that time period. The collection might change a little bit, but overall, the good starting point is figure out what data you want to collect, the basic data over those numbers of years, and stick with it. And that's the best way to help do that is look at other departments' reports and see what they're collecting and see what they've discovered to be whatever they call best practices. The second thing, I guess, no, I'm actually in the third warning now. The third warning is you got to have a research analyst. You got to have a person that's well-trained and knows how to do this stuff. If you're a small 3-person shop and you've got a director and an assistant and an investigator or whatever have you, that's probably not going to cut it in order to do a report that reaches the caliber that withstands public scrutiny and police department scrutiny and really is helping the department and the community out. A research analyst that's trained and can do this stuff is really, in my mind, essential. Because even with the report that we put out, that really consumes probably at least a couple months straight of man hours minimum for a trained research analyst just to put together the initial draft data reporting. And that's after we got to the point where we now have electronic filing system, and we have an Excel spreadsheet that breaks down, pulls all the information out of the electronic reporting system into an Excel spreadsheet rather than trying to manually draw out the data. If you have to manually extract data from the use of force reports, from a couple thousand use of force reports, you're going to be issuing force reports that are 2 or 3 years old. It's going to take you a long time to do each annual report. So trained research analyst, that's number 3 on my warning list. That I really say you got to have that. So that means you got to have the budget too, and you got to have the personnel to do it. So the data element should be consistent over time. I think the other main point I want to put out there is, and I mentioned it briefly, and I'll call it warning number 4, is with respect to the scrutiny of the report. It's got to withstand a high degree of public scrutiny. There will likely be a lot of people, educated research people looking at that report, and you got to make sure that all the information is valid and that there's been a proper audit conducted. And the way we did it here, just as one example that you could draw on, is that almost every time the oversight agency will be getting all of its data from the police department. Well, there's a certain degree of trust involved in there, and some community members will not believe that that information is correct simply because it's not directly obtained. It's obtained from the police department, passing it over to the oversight agency, if that's the reporting chain of command. Well, one of the ways that you can help overcome that is you can conduct an audit of those reports. So if you are not, like we are here, we are not looking at all 2,400 some use of force reports that are being filed on an annual basis in Washington, D.C. It would take us a long time to do that and try to pull out the information. So what we did was, and I wrote this down from my research analyst in our office, she indicated that we use, and this is for the research people that are watching, she used a chi-square goodness of fit test to determine what size audit sample we should use so that we can determine the validity of the sample. And what that means is our number was 117. So she used this formula and came up with the idea that we have to pull out manually 117 use of force reports, and that will give us a good audit sample of the 2,400 total reports. So instead of looking at a couple thousand reports, we look at 117 of them and audit them to make sure all the information is correct, the officer entered it correctly, and that the information in that report matches the incident at the scene, and possibly look at the incident reports, offense reports. Once in a while, if you want to pull the body-worn camera footage and look at that, just to confirm and assure the community that yes, you believe all of this information that you're reporting is correct. So that's my number 4 warning, is withstand scrutiny by making sure there's a good audit of the of the material. In addition to all the three other points that I made. And I wanted to mention too, before I turn it back to Susan, I wanted to mention one example of how this can be used. And I'll take the simplest example I can think of right now. And that is one of the things we're collecting, and this was in Milwaukee, not in DC, was negligent discharges of firearms. Every time a firearm discharges negligently, we collected all that data. And that was kind of a small data set, but we found that in 1 year, there were about 6 negligent discharges in the city of Milwaukee, which is a department of about 2,000 sworn personnel, which is neither here nor there about what the number is. But what we found was 5 out of the 6 negligent discharges happened while the officer was off duty and happened while the officer was not using a holster. He either had the firearm in a pocket or had it in a waistband or some other means of carrying it, but it was not in a holster. So the recommendation on that particular little item was formulate a policy requiring officers to have a holster. That holster will be approved by the department to be used off duty. Then that policy was passed, the next year we had 0 negligent discharges that were caused by negligent use of a firearm that was caused by a holster issue or lack of using a holster. And that was 2 officers less that were injured, and probably some innocent bystanders that could have been injured that were not, simply because we pulled off some data and we made some recommendations, and something that the police department wasn't aware of because they weren't accumulating that information. So that's just one example of how we can use the information and pulling out the right data to start with. It can be really useful. So thanks. I'll turn it back over to Susan then.
Oh, thanks, Mike. You didn't leave me anything. You really covered that pretty thoroughly. Just want to echo that. Super important. Like I said in my opening remarks, we bought the database to make sure we could have access to it. So we had backdoor access, all kinds of access. Up until we gave them the database to run in 2015 or so, 14, 15 or so. And so now we aren't getting that. We are getting a replica of the database instead of being able to go in and grab it ourselves. And we're not satisfied with that. And we don't think our community is either. So we're going to continue to fight on that to make sure we can get into it. We do monitor and review the most serious uses of force and attend the use of force review boards and provide recommendations on those. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about some of these tear gas incidents that have occurred and some of the force being used at some of these uprisings that have gone on as we go forward here. But we have not had an auditor to be able to, full-time auditor to be able to do the audits that we would love to be able to do. We did invest in a data analyst because when I told you we were publishing NOPD's reports previously, that was me pulling out that data, which, I'm going to give myself credit on being a lawyer, not on being anything related to data savvy or ready. So, we did what we had to do, just basic numbers, but no analysis of any kind, because of course that's not what we do. So just want to echo that, having somebody who can handle that for you, first of all, pays dividends in use of force and in every other aspect of what you do. If I could go back again and just start all over, and I had an ordinance which told me who I had to hire, but if I could go back all again and fight that and just hire who I needed, data analyst would be number 1, and then somebody to report what we're doing would be number 2. So so people will know what you're doing. A data analyst can put out all kinds of hard-hitting reports. Get a chance to look at the reports that Vera Institute puts out, just real quick, hard-hitting ones about relevant topics. So the more you can do that as an oversight agency, the better. And again, when we talk about tear gas, we want to talk about some information we were able to give to our community. Mike had talked earlier about police departments being afraid of what's in the data is one of the reasons that they kind of stall and push back against putting out data. Want to add to it what he also talked about, which was accuracy. When we got here, we found out that when I got here, I found out NOPD had a lot of systems that they had created themselves that, some guys had put together, or they had an Excel spreadsheet or something like that that was super problematic for accuracy. And then how they reported collected data, as Mike was talking about, was really problematic. Looked at racial profiling and stop and frisk, and you couldn't tell who was actually driving the car, or was the pedestrian stopped, or if it was a car full of people who got searched or who got frisked, etc. So just you'll get a chance to make, we've over the years been able to make a lot of recommendations about collecting data, and as Mike said, about having uniform systems for reporting data, which we solved some of that with one standard system, but then you also have to format that system to make sure that people can't skip certain steps, or you know, you need to have drop down menus so people aren't typing in whatever they want to. Just some of the stuff that you're going to find really junks up the works as you're working on that. So those are some of the things that we've been able to do to get into the data. We have front end access, but again, we want that back end access to make sure we can see what's going on with the system itself as well. So, but again, just want to echo what Mike said in terms of what you're looking at, criteria, warnings, and help about working on data.
Thank you both. That's incredibly insightful, and I think that you know, Susan, what you were speaking to about form design and how much that really influences the quality of the data and the consistency of the data, that is such an important component of being able to write a report that accurately reflects the use of force for that period. You know, with that said, let's move on to the actual process of analyzing the data and determining, you know, what are different ways that we can look at this data that would be of interest to the community, and what are ways that we can look at this data in ways to improve the force reporting system or improving the use of force policy. You know, when most people think about use of force, they really think about, you know, the major things like firearm discharges or the racial disproportionalities in the use of force. But there are certainly a bunch of other ways to look at force, you know, including, you know, some more information about the underlying incidents and those encounters that led to the use of force, or the number of actual force used within a particular incident. And both of your reports, and I do again want to just plug the websites, you can see the Office of Police Complaints reports at policecomplaints.dc.gov, and the Independent Police Monitors reports at NOLAIPM.gov. Not if that's correct, Susan, I believe so.
Right.
Yes. Cool. So yeah, so let's get into you know, some of the analysis that you guys choose to include to your reports, and we have some sample pages in the coming slides that we can move on to as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And thanks for plugging that. I think it's there's a couple of other good examples out there. You can find them all over the web. But what we want to do now, I think, is bring up a couple of things. I want to mention a couple of things too as we go to slide number 4, and we'll look at some of the examples of some pages, because one of the things I want to mention is before we got to this page, what we're looking at now is one of the pages from the DC report. Before we got to this point, we explained in several pages the methodology that we use to do the analysis. I think that's very important to include in your public use of force reporting, how we got there. This is how we got the information, and this is how we validated it. And this is the process that we used. And also, we spent a great deal of time explaining what the police department's policies and procedures and their training are on use of force. So before we even got, at least in our report, when you look at it, before we even got to any actual reporting, we spent the first 15 pages or so of our report explaining how we got there. And that's really important to withstand public scrutiny and to help the community understand where this information is coming from. So this first slide is sort of a good example of, in fact, the next few slides I tried to pull out sort of the biggies, the ones that community members have most questions about. And that's the ones we'll just take a quick look at here, and then I think Susan's going to do the same on her report. But you'll note that a couple little things on this is, and I really emphasize this in our office with our research analysts, people is this report really, I emphasize trying to use infographics that a community member or anybody, an executive director of an oversight agency can look at and actually read and understand at quick glance. And we don't have to read 14 or 15 different footnotes to figure out what this chart really means. You'll see right now, basic information everybody wants to know. How many times does use of force happen? And we see here we monitored it over the last 5 years in DC. This is the 2019 report. And we show that there was a significant increase over the first 3 years, and then it leveled off. That part of that increase is explained in the narrative of the report. And part of that increase is a result of a change in use of force reporting, and that more types of use of force were required to be reported. So naturally, the number of force reports and incidents increased. So we don't just put up an infographic up there. It's important to explain why it went up, because that's going to be the first question out of anybody's mouth is, holy cow, it went up quite a bit. Why? So we explain that, but also at the bottom of that chart on use of force incidents, you'll see that there were 3.4 average use of force incidents per day. That's district-wide in the nation's capital, not 3.4 per hour, not 3.4 every 5 minutes like people might believe from watching TV, but about 3 incidents per day of use of force. And it comes down to maybe probably about 1.5% of every arrest that's made results in a use of force, and that's explained also in our report in different places. So we try to give an overall context of the report, and this is important for the community to understand the overall context, I think. And then the officers using force, how many of them? And you'll see that about a third of officers in MPD, that's the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., about a third of the officers use force once all year. They didn't use force every day. They didn't use force 10 times a day during the shift. A third of the officers only use force once a year. So information like that's quick infographic. I think the takeaway on that is we try to make it usable. We try to get the biggies out of the way right away with the basic information, and try to make it as easy as possible to read. Let's go to the next slide, Mike. The next biggie I think that people are going to have questions about, go back, there we go, is level of force. This, if you look close, and if you can't see it on the screen, you can look on the website on the actual report if you want, and there's a link for it. This just demonstrates that what type of force results in the most types of injury, and how many people get injured when force is used. For instance, a takedown, a physical takedown, one of the most common uses of force in DC and many police departments, also results in the most types of injuries. And we also see that in almost 1 out of every 10 uses of force, an officer gets hurt. And that's important for the department to understand what types of use of force an officer gets hurt in, because that can inform the officer's training and in-service training. And these are the types of incidents we should be training more for, maybe to prevent some of those injuries from occurring. And then the same thing goes for community members. We see that overall types of use of force, we see 61% of all types of use of force result in injury to a subject. So by reducing use of force, overall, we can reduce injury to members of the community and to officers. And that's what we're trying to show basically in that graph. Let's go to the next one. And we've only got 4 slides here of examples. So this next one is the other biggie that people always want to know about. That's the demographics of officers and the subjects that had force used on them. DC's population right now is a little bit over 700,000. We have a sworn officer force of a little bit under 4,000 right now. And we see the demographics of the police department right below that. And then we see the demographics of the community as far as race, gender, and race, age, and gender for both officers and for the community in general. And then the last part is we break it down on what the most likely matchup was in any use of force, and we identify that, what types of officers, and then we describe later on the next page. We don't have a graph of that, but we describe in the narrative what the most common matchups are and why that is, and try to offer more information to the community about when use of force is and how race, age of the officer, age of the subject, and how it all interacts and what the most common interactions are. And that's a graph that we point to quite often because a lot of community members and police departments have questions about this, and this breaks it down, and I'll lay it out in a very easy to read infographic. And one more slide, Mike, the next one, because I want to give time to turn it over to Susan. And the last slide I want to talk about is where they happen. This is the fourth biggie that you're going to get questions on, at least we do all the time, where the use of force is occurring. And just a quick synopsis here. It shows that the officers that are using the most use of force ratio-wise are being used by officers that are in special units. In DC, they're called NSID units. They're the gun recovery units and specialized units that are doing extra patrols. And also we have listed, and we put a pin graph there, pin satellite photo of the District of Columbia, where the use of force is reported, how many districts, how the district rate in use of force, and how different police service agencies, that's PSAs on the graph, what the main PSAs that use the most use of force are. So there, from that graph, people can quickly look at where the most force is used and which officers and which assignments utilize the most force. And then in the narrative, we make an effort to explain why that is. So those are just some examples that hopefully you can draw upon when you look at what your use of force reporting is. So I'll turn it back over to Susan and Mike.
Thanks, Mike. We have some pages from Susan's reports as well. So the next slide.
Yeah, and we look at some similar, attributes of the data. There are a good group of officers who commit the most force or use the most force. So we look at stuff like that. We usually break it down by districts, which are, a few are heavily integrated, but most are kind of, what the makeup of folks living in that district or that area mostly look like. So we break it down similarly to what Mike talked about. Averages per day, per month, stuff like that. Sometimes we like to look and see if it's about Mardi Gras or festivals or something like, or one year we had a bunch of force being used during Jazz Fest, so we looked at that. So you just look at those different, trying to see if anything comes out of the data. You can go to the next one, Mike. This was looking at the justification for force. When we looked at this a few years ago, we found out, when we talked a little earlier about data not being accurate, we found out a lot of time NOPD would throw reasons or justifications for force into an other category, or it would say miscellaneous or something like that, which made it really difficult to analyze and figure out why they did what they did. So we were able to bring that down from prior years just by reporting on it and talking to them about that, and just making sure that they're able to be more accurate so that it can be assessed. As we go forward and create this public-facing database and look at what information we need in it, one of the things we noted is we need to break it down better. We get an email for each use of force that occurs, and over, you'll see it sometimes in spurts, but you'll note that a number of these incidents of using force are against folks who have mental illness, and those are the types of calls that it was occurring on. So we want to going forward be able to talk about what that looks like better, and we're working with our community to put that report together, and then also to make sure that that data is available. Mike talked about methodology. If you go to our website, NOLA-IPM.gov, you're going to see annual reports, and that's where most of our data is. There's also a link in each year's report to the data. We put our methodology in there. It's kind of a free source kind of website where you can see what it is we did, why we did it. But I agree with Mike, that's absolutely important to do that. One year we noted, and I don't think we put this on the next slide. What's on the next slide, Mike? I forgot. Oh, we just broke down what type of calls they were. So you see calls for service and then arrests as well. And that's the last one, Mike. A few years ago, we noted that, I don't want to get my note here. That the national average for, so we try to put information in our use of force reports, and we usually break it down in 2 different reports. We didn't do it for the last one. We weren't able to do that for 2019 because we had a cyber attack which knocked out all of our data. But normally we do 2 types of use of force reports. There's the data report, which is strictly about all use of force, lower levels and the most serious incidents. And then we have a separate report that looks at only the most serious incidents or critical incidents. And so what we noted was that in looking at all force, there was a national average. I don't remember exactly what the number was. It was very low percentage that were found to be unauthorized, and most everything was found to be authorized. And so, and you know, the standard for it is very loose. So of course, you know, that probably is something that would happen. But we noted that year that NOPD's was way below that. Their findings of unauthorized force was so low in comparison to the national average. Well, what do you think happened over the next couple of years? It went back up. It went up and it started reaching that average the years after that of finding unauthorized force, finding out that some of these incidents were unauthorized. So that made a difference in some of their work. Now, it's not 50% of the force being found to be unauthorized, but it did make a difference in them being more critical about how force was being used. So that was important. And then I want to just talk about critical incident data. You may call it something else, level 4s or the most serious. Those are the incidents that we pay the most attention to because of the history of what happened in New Orleans and how our office was even created because of the horrific incidents that occurred around Katrina. So we always, whether I have 1 person or 10 people, that's always our priority, as it is for your cities as well. But we also, in those reports, break down information about how well the investigations into those incidents occur and some data about that. Are they asking leading questions? Were they sequestering officers so they couldn't talk and look at what was going on? How well did they, collect evidence and preserve evidence? These were all things that were problems prior to our office being created and helped NOPD get into a consent decree. So we keep data about that to the investigations into these use of force incidents as well. And then the final thing I wanted to say is we talked about disparity. As we know, African Americans make up around 55–60% of the population, but like we saw in D.C. and other places that have been through consent decrees or are in consent decrees, the level of force used against African Americans is way above that. It'll be 70, 80, 90% in some of our districts around the city. We need to get into that more and work with our community to figure out solutions to that. And that's it. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. So we're hitting the hour mark, and I do want to leave some time for questions, but I would like to at least take 5 minutes real quick to go over, let's say, at least maybe one policy change or a recommendation that has emerged from your analyses of force data. So if either of you, or at least both of you, could provide just one big thing that has come up in terms of the analysis that your offices have been doing, and what kind of impact that has had in subsequent years. We can move on to questions from our viewers after that.
Yeah, I'll answer that this way, Mike. And I'll say it this way. At the end of our report, we made a series of recommendations. I think the most important aspect of that was we made a number of recommendations that serve to improve the data collection so that going forward, we're able to issue a good, accurate, valid report. I think all of those recommendations collectively were probably one of the more important things we did, because I think we're on track now, at least here, with a good, valid reporting system and collecting system, and we weren't in that kind of shape just maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So I gave the example earlier about a gun, about the unholstered negligent discharges. There's numerous other examples I think that every community will be able to come up with to show how this information is helpful. One of the things on the for the way going forward on serious use of force reporting, like Susan looked at, one of the things we're trying to work towards here is tracking every round that gets fired downrange by every officer, to help inform the community and the department about what happens with every bullet that's fired. Did it strike the subject? How far away was the officer? Was it dark or light conditions? Was it a result of a traffic stop? Was it a field contact? Was the officer standing, sitting, kneeling at the time? Was there any type of force used before that? And a whole list of other factors to try to narrow down when the most likely time that a firearm will be discharged and what the scenarios are. And that way the police department will be able to train for that, and the community will be able to understand when it actually happens. So those are the examples that I'll give you right now. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to wrap up, Mike, we talked about some of the issues with data quality that we talked about, and recommendations about how to keep better data about it. But one of the recommendations we have coming up is a forward-facing one. After the uprisings last year, we only had one incident that involved tear gas, but in that incident, an issue that we had brought up in 2016 came up to rear its ugly head. We found out that NOPD had to admit that they did not have a policy about the use of tear gas and these other types of munitions, which we had brought to their attention in 2016. And the consent decree monitors, the court, DOJ, none of them had agreed to handle that issue going forward. It came back up in 2020 after the use of tear gas, finding out that there was no policy, procedure, and so on and so forth. And so now we found out there was no reporting requirements either. So now we're going back and pulling SWAT data, because SWAT are the only units that use tear gas, pulling all their reports to create some more data about how many times did this occur in the past, because these were not reported. We did not roll out to them, so on and so forth. So that one's actually something that we're working on for the future.
Great, right on time. Thank you both. We're going to move on to questions now. We have a number of questions from folks attending the webinar. Cammie's going to read them for us, and we can get going. We have about 25 minutes.
Yes, we do have quite a few questions from the audience, so let's get started with them. So the first one is, so if we know the reasons why many are not engaged in gathering and reporting use of data, and the reasons why that is, what suggestions do you have to gain support, particularly in small to medium-sized jurisdictions, to make this happen?
We always use community to kind of influence the police, but there are a number of policing organizations out there working on that as well. PERF is working on something I talked about, which is public-facing databases for police departments, which will be coming out at some point in the future. You know, this is the wave of the future. It didn't happen last year after the uprisings, but Congress, both parties put out information about public-facing databases needing to be, or databases about police activities needing to be out there. So it's the wave of the future. A lot of police departments are enjoying, and our police department included, being on the forefront of change in policing. And so that's the way it really makes sense for them to join in this stuff. They like being on the forefront of it and being leaders in it for other police departments.
Thanks, Susan. The next question we have is, how did you decide what data was most important to collect and report on?
What we looked at was, frankly, we looked at a number of other police department reports that were public facing, and we got a couple of them that weren't upon request, and looked at some other oversight agencies that have been reporting data in the past, and we try to pick out the best examples. The report that you're looking at, and that Cami put the link up in the chat box on for DC, that we're not the originators of those ideas. Those ideas were drawn from a lot of other agencies, a lot of other departments, and we try to just gain best practices from different places, just like people watching this today can gain some best practices and steal some of our ideas from the reports that are up in the up on our links. We don't have to reinvent the wheel on this. One of the factors, I think you have to look at the limiting factors as one way of choosing what you're going to collect. Your departments might be limited in what they can collect and how much data they can and what techniques they have in the data report system. So other than the limiting data, I mean, the sky is the limit as far as what you really can and want to collect. Just get out there and look at the best practices. And like I said earlier, try to get set on what you want to collect long term. Spend a lot of time on what you're going to collect and what you're going to report on initially, because you want to keep carrying that information over year after year and building on it and comparing it year after year. So if you start out year one with collecting the wrong, reporting wrong information, you're going to have to go back to square one the following year, and it'll be harder to synthesize the subsequent reports.
Can I just jump in there? One thing, just want to reemphasize what I've said all along, this community. What does your community need to hear? And what is relevant at the time? What is going on right now that people want to hear? For instance, in New Orleans, an issue came up at a city council meeting about an officer and prior histories and the number of incidents he had been involved in, and the community wanted to know more about that. That's going to be built into our database going forward and reported on.
And I think for our next question, I think both of you touched on this, but can you just reiterate, how often would you need to collect the data? Monthly, quarterly, semi-annually? What are your suggestions?
I can start on that one, Mike, because we just had a recent update. So we had been working on conduits between us and the city to get their data. We want it to update regularly, and I believe it now updates on a daily basis, the complaints and use of force data from IA Pro, so that we can access it. We do want more real time, or as close to real time as we can get, because sometimes if you want to be relevant in a conversation, you need to grab some data right away, and you want the most accurate.
Yeah, and we do it quarterly in DC. The main reason being for that is we can accumulate it. That putting out the daily data would be time consuming I have one research analyst. So we try to collect it quarterly. And then by the time we get to the end of the year, it's presumably a simpler process that we've already got 3/4 of the year data already into our system, and we're already well started on our report. Then we can put out a report quicker at the end of the year that way, because then we're just left with 1/4, the final quarter of the year to report on.
Thank you. So next we have the question, can you talk a bit about whether you do or can track disciplinary outcomes from use of force incidents?
Yeah, there might be some FOIA open records restrictions with respect to that. I think one of the things about that to keep in mind is, at least in DC, what we do is we do publish the outcomes of serious use of force incidents in our report. You'll see whether each serious use of force incident that went to the review board was justified or not justified. For instance, last year when we looked at all serious use of force that involves fracture, unconsciousness, firearms discharge, things like that, 19% of those incidents were found to be not justified, not within policy. And we publicize that data. And then on all of our shooting instances, we get into more detail on each officer-involved shooting and describe whether that particular officer-involved shooting was ultimately determined to be justified or not justified. But we don't get into the disciplinary part of it. In DC, we have some constraints through the FOIA regulations. We follow federal FOIA regulations. For the most part, it mirrors that. And we don't release information on disciplinary data with respect to use of force as of today yet.
And similar to Mike, we have a standalone report that I talked about that looked at the more serious use of force incidents and look at whether or not they were authorized or not by the use of force review board, and then also whether or not they were accepted by the DA for prosecution, which, as you can imagine, most of them were not. We look at those in that standalone report. In our complaints section of our annual report, the data is broken down by allegation so that you can see whether or not it was authorized force or not. But we don't do any type of special report about misconduct or how use of force, the penalties for use of force, which is a good one to do to really relate them.
Thank you. We do not have oversight. Our police department is resistant to sharing information. How do we convince our city council and police department that data should be collected and shared with the public? Any suggestions? Because I know that that's a problem in many cities.
It really is. I just got to say again, over and over again, community, community, community. When COVID struck, we joined a coalition of about 40 organizations, and we were only there were only two governmental organizations involved, us and the public defender. And it was a number of social justice and criminal justice change organizations, community members, all who were surrounded, who all got together around summonses or tickets instead of arrests. And that was the start of it. And then whether or not officers were wearing PPE, so on and so forth. And so that really started a movement that has really paid a number of dividends here in our city. Those coalitions, each part of that coalition has some different perspective. For instance, there was a part called Eye on Surveillance that wanted to stop surveillance technologies. We had the public defender who needed more equal funding. We had public-facing database, and we wanted an ordinance, and another group wanted an ordinance that required NOPD to issue summonses instead of arresting people, because we couldn't get the police to agree to do it just by policy. And because of that force and the size of that coalition and the number of people who could weigh into city council and write letters, and mental health in the jail is another issue. Because of the size of that coalition and that it was grassroots, community, educators, whatever, it's been able to make a number of change. A number of ordinances have been passed, and there are more to come. So, and we're in a very red state, a very conservative state that last year put up a bill that said if there was any defunding of police, the cities were going to be defunded as well. So, just you make change where you can. Find allies where you can, but there's definitely strength in numbers.
And I'll add two more quick things to that, and just the community, which is the biggie, but two more links to that, I think, is the elected officials, because they have to answer the community. Every police chief reports most police chiefs report to either the mayor or the local council or both. Some of them are appointed by independent oversight agencies, but most of them report to elected officials. Those elected officials report to the electorate. And as Susan was indicating, working through the community is a big part of that in convincing the elected officials people that actually directly appoint the police executives to get on board with this. That's really important. If you don't have that, you're not going to have anything. The other second quick point on that is trying to gain an understanding from the police department about why they don't want to do it. Maybe it is because of their budget. If it is a budget issue, then maybe there's a way we can fix the budget. But if they have some knee-jerk response reason why they don't want to do that one, then we have to explore that further too. But so two things: understanding why they don't want to, maybe trying to fix that, and two, getting the elected officials really on board and backing it.
And sir, I wanted to agree with all that Mike said and just add one more thing. What we brought to the equation, as well as the other governmental agency, was access to data and information that helped inform our community, which was huge. You know, they needed numbers. We all got together to be able to have numbers behind their arguments as well. So that was also a big part of it.
Thank you, Susan and Mike. That was very helpful. Our next question is based around Portland. So in Portland, the Police Bureau does not report crowd control use of force data along with other use of force data. How typical is this? And then secondly, the Police Bureau claims that the baseline to determine disproportionate policing should not be demographic data on presence in general population, but other baselines like crime victim or car accident data when looking at stops data. How typical is using presence in population as baseline?
Okay, I'll take that first, I guess. For the first part of the question with crowd control use of force reporting, you may have heard we have, every once in a while, we have a demonstration in our nation's capital. And we've had a few lately. I'm being a little facetious. We probably have several of them every day, whether they're permitted or not permitted, year round. But the policy in Washington D.C. is any use of force used in those demonstration activities is a reportable use of force, just as it would be in any other type of incident. And we do monitor that and make sure that that is the case. And the supervisors on the police department also monitor it and make sure it's reported. That's the first part. And the second part, as far as what you want to, if I understand the question right, I mean, what that comes down to is how much you want to report. As we get more sophisticated in our reporting, and right now, 20 years from now, I think we're going to look back at what we're doing this year and next year with the use of force reporting as sort of the starting point at the beginning. And I think the question that Cami just asked speaks to where we can go with this if we do this right. And if we start analyzing, collecting the data the right way, we can really expand the use of the information to help the community and help the police department. And I think the question indicated some of those things that we can start collecting at some point in the future. But the way I see it right now, we're at the beginning stages and we got to get our foot in the door. And once we do that, we can start breaking it down and doing an even better job going forward.
Jamie, what was the question? Was it how many voluntarily report or are required to report? I wasn't sure exactly what the question.
Well, it just asked if how typical is it that a police bureau or department wouldn't report crowd control use of force data along with other use of force data?
Well, sometimes, you know, we see that legislatures have to step in and require it. So, of course, it depends on where you live at and what's required. What I like about Louisiana, surprisingly, is very much a public record state, and just about everything has sunshine on it. So we're able to just report a lot, even if the police won't. Oh, there was a second part to the question, but what was that?
And I apologize. As soon as you stopped, I deleted the question.
Oh, sorry.
So
long.
And if the person who posed that question could just write that second. Oh, he already has. Just a moment. How typical is using presence in population as a baseline? So the first part of that is the Police Bureau in Portland claims that the baseline to determine disproportionate policing should not be demographic data on presence in general population, but other baselines like crime victim or car accident data when looking at stop data, and how typical is using presence in population as a baseline as opposed to how the Portland Police Bureau is doing it.
I can just only say for us is to start. Racial disparity is an issue. It just is. And so you got to start somewhere. But we don't just limit it to that. We also look at arrest data, whatever other kinds of data we can bring in, stop and frisk, tickets, whatever it may be. We're trying to look at, and then demographics in the particular area, break it down by district so we can look at demographics in each district of the city as well. But I think it's definitely a part of the equation, and there's no way they'd get me to remove that.
That's the importance of civilian oversight, looking at the data, right? To make sure that it's being reported in a way that actually sheds light on the reality of the situation.
Exactly.
Next, we have a question. There are a lot of them, so hold on a second. So Susan, can you there's several people who would like to know if you could give a general or rough estimate of the database, the iPro system that you purchased in New Orleans.
An estimate of the cost?
Yes.
Golly, I think we started out with 1,600 officers, and I think we're down to 1,200 or so. So I don't know if it's based on I don't remember if it's based on the size of the police force. But I want to say it was around $150,000 in 2011 to get started with that. And then each year the maintenance is around $7,000, $8,000 or so. We have an internal one for us to use, and we have the one that the police department uses as well.
Thank you. What are some red flags as far as data is concerned that would be indicators of problems with policy or practices in a department? I know that there are probably lots of red flags. Can you just give some examples of those?
I'll tick off a few of them. When you start looking at the data over a number of years, if you see an increase in use of force, whether it's in a particular district or if it's department-wide, that's a red flag that has to be, that's an obvious red flag that has to be looked at and determine why that's happening, especially if it's at a particular district and on a particular shift. That's a red flag. That's something we in particular look for here when we break down the data to shifts, assignments, and police service areas. Which of those have the highest incidence of use of force? That's really an excellent use of the data, is calling that at a minimum, calling that to the attention of the department so that we can better monitor those particular shifts or those particular units that have the highest use of force. Maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe it's a good reason and maybe it's not, but you don't know until you look at it. So that would be one red flag. Another one, one more typical, I guess, that you might see if I could come up with a quick example of one would be where not only when the data goes up, but if the data goes down. Is the data going down because there's less reporting is the first thing that pops into mind. Is all of a sudden, oh, this year we have a 13%, I'm picking these numbers out of the air, we have a 13% decrease in number of use of force incidents. That should be a red flag. That's a huge change. Why? Has our incidents now not being reported that were being reported before? Or look at all the different reasons why. Was the policy changed and what gets reported? There's a myriad of different things, and once you, the key to that question, the key to that answer to that question is start looking at things over a year-to-year basis, so that you can see differences. Because otherwise, you have nothing to compare it to. You can't really compare it to other departments and other use of force reports because their reporting mechanisms are inevitably different, and what they report and what's reportable is inevitably different. Really, your best source of comparative analysis is your own annual reports. So anything you see different year to year is a good red flag starting point.
Yeah, I just would agree with Mike and say, starting with the accuracy of the data is super important. Looking for, if you've got a bunch of miscellaneous categories or missing data in certain of the columns or tables, that's a red flag. because that really hurts your ability to do an analysis. But we've also looked at things like Mike talked about negligent discharges. In 2014 or 2015, NOPD made pointing your weapon a level 1 use of force. And so that caused the number of uses of force to jump. Not surprisingly, it also caused the number of negligent discharges also to jump. So those were some things we saw there. And then because we get, daily reminders of what's going on with force, we kept seeing a particular officer's name and then started looking at the data overall. And what we found out, this particular officer was responsible for like a quarter of the use of force in a district. So we were able to do some relevant recommendations to the NOPD about supervision for this particular officer. So, you could get red flags from anywhere and then jump into the data to see more about it.
Thank you to both of you for that. So what are your thoughts on implementing national standards for data reporting to ensure that cross-jurisdictional consistency in reporting can occur, and then also comparisons between cities? What would be the possible benefits and challenges that you see with that?
I really would kick that to Mike, but I'll just say the second part of it, it would be awesome to be able to go find comparables for every city, especially a city your size. We all have to do that at some point in time. When you're trying to make a point or make a recommendation, that would be fantastic. But for actually the details of it, I would have to kick that to Mike, the on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Susan. No, actually, that is something that we thought about a lot. And first of all, there's a lot of obstacles to having a national reporting system because of all the different variables in different agencies, communities. But there were a lot of, think of it this way, there were a lot of obstacles to initially reporting crime data on a national level because crimes are defined differently in different statutes in communities and states. But the FBI manages to do that every year with annual crime data for all police departments. The Part A and Part B reportable crimes. So they figured out a way to do it for crime data. And like I said at the beginning of this presentation, if they can do it for crime data, why aren't we doing it for use of force data? I think there's a way to do it on a national level. We're not quite there yet on figuring that out, but I think ultimately it'll be a huge help to, again, both the community and police departments, just like the crime data that's published now, the national crime data is published now is a huge assistance.
I'd like to hear Mike V. What do you think about that too? You're definitely a data guy.
Yeah, it definitely is a challenge. I do think that there's an issue of having consistent use of force policies themselves and how different types of force are categorized. Then there's a logistical issue of, smaller police departments may not be able to track these things systematically in the way that would be required for a national database. There's an issue of course, compliance and ensuring that things are categorized correctly and are reported accurately to the main database. There are a bunch of obstacles, but as Mike said, there were obstacles for crime statistics, and so I do think that it is a thing that can be overcome, but there's definitely a lot of logistical issues that would be involved.
Thank you to all of you. I think we have time for one more question. And I apologize to all of those of you who are still in queue with your questions. We will try to send those out to our panelists and get your questions answered following the webinar for those of you who did not get your questions asked. So when assessing force necessity, how do you account for the officer's escalation of the situation before force was used?
Well, I'll just say this. We, NOPD policy requires them to de-escalate first. But, in any given circumstance, there could always be a need to go to the highest level if needs be, and officers are usually able to articulate something like that. But in where you see the most analysis of this is during these use of force review boards and trying to see where supervisors are trying to hold the officers involved accountable for using de-escalation. And we've seen a lot more of that now and more discussions about that now. It took a while to get there though, because it was only, we're solely going to look at what happened in the incident. I mean, sorry, we're solely going to look at when force was used and not look at what happened up prior to that point. So we're seeing a lot more of that now. I don't have any data though on that, but it's good to see.
Yeah, same thing. I mean, we follow the department's policies and procedures in determining whether the proper protocols were followed with respect to de-escalation, and then what type of tactics that were used. Those are all set out very specifically in the Metropolitan Police Department's policies and procedures and in their training. So we have a good guideline to follow as far as whether it pertained to that. And by the way, we do, the officers do report on, and we put it in our report too, about what the subject was doing and what level of response the officer used. And we compare that to make sure that the response that the officer used, what level of force he or she used, was consistent with the policy and training, because that policy sets forth exactly what kind of force can be used in response to what level of force the officer is being faced with. So it can be better. It's not the perfect system, but that's the best one we have right now.
And with that, I think we'll have to wrap up today's webinar. Again, thank you to all of you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today, and to all of our audience members who took time out of their day to be with us. The 2021 NACOLE webinar series has just begun. Registration will soon open for our February and March webinars. On February 23rd, we will welcome Dave Moss of the Electronic Frontier Foundation to discuss police surveillance technologies. And on March 3rd, we'll be welcoming Deborah Jacobs of the Ernest Becker Foundation, along with Dr. John Muscali and Dr. Sheldon Solomon, to discuss death anxiety and police culture. Again, please watch your inboxes for notification that the registration for these two events is opened. Thank you, and I look forward to being with you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.